My name is Maya Patel, and I'm writing this from my therapist's office in San Francisco, where I've spent the last year working through the accumulated trauma from nearly a decade of dating experiences as an Indian American woman whose brown skin, dark hair, and South Asian features have marked me as exotic, fantasy rather than complete human being deserving genuine connection. From dating app matches who message me specifically because they have yellow fever, despite me being South Asian. Revealing how racial fetishization doesn't even distinguish between Asian ethnicities, to first dates where men express disappointment that I'm too Americanized and don't have the submissive personality they expected, to relationships that fell apart when partners realized I was an actual person with opinions, ambitions, and boundaries rather than the compliant Asian fantasy they had projected onto my body. At 29, I've been told I'm exotic, spicy, praised for my sexy accent I don't have, asked if I'm submissive like Asian women are supposed to be, fetishized for stereotypes about my sexuality and personality based entirely on my race, and treated as sexual object and trophy girlfriend rather than partner, creating profound trauma about whether anyone will ever want me for who I actually am rather than for the racist fantasies they project onto my brown skin. The fetishization awareness began in college when I started dating and quickly realized that my race was often the primary factor in men's interest rather than my personality, shared interests, or individual qualities that had nothing to do with my ethnicity. The pattern became clear when multiple dating experiences followed similar trajectories, initial intense interest that seemed flattering until I realized it was focused on my exotic appearance, comments about how much the person had always wanted to date an Indian or Asian woman, and eventual disappointment or loss of interest when I didn't match the stereotypes they had projected onto me. The exotic label became a red flag that I learned to recognize as coded language for racial fetishization. When men described me as exotic, they meant I looked different from white women in ways they found sexually intriguing, positioning my brownness as foreign, other, and existing primarily for their sexual fascination rather than acknowledging me as American-born person with my own cultural identity that wasn't about performing otherness for white male consumption. The word exotic reduced me to specimen of racial difference rather than recognizing my full humanity. The dating app nightmare intensified when online dating became mainstream and I joined platforms hoping to find genuine connection, only to discover that my profile attracted overwhelming numbers of men who explicitly stated preferences for Asian women, exotic beauties, or Indian girls, revealing that my race was the primary attraction rather than anything about my actual personality or interests. The messages I received were often explicitly sexual, making comments about stereotypes regarding Indian women's sexuality, asking if I would perform cultural practices they fetishized, or expressing that they had always wanted to try an Indian woman as if I were sexual experience rather than human being. The submissive stereotype pressure emerged constantly as men who fetishized Asian women projected expectations of submissiveness, compliance, and traditional gender roles onto me based entirely on racist stereotypes rather than anything I had said or done. When I expressed opinions, asserted boundaries, or demonstrated the independent, ambitious personality I actually possessed, these men would express confusion or disappointment that I wasn't behaving like the submissive Asian fantasy they expected, sometimes explicitly stating I was too Americanized or not really Asian, because I didn't match their stereotypes. The accent fetishization was particularly absurd and offensive as men who had clearly never heard me speak would message me complimenting my sexy accent or asking me to say things in my native language, revealing that they were projecting fantasies based on my appearance rather than responding to anything about my actual identity. I was born in San Jose, raised speaking English, and have a standard American accent without any Indian inflection, but men assumed I had an accent because they wanted me to fit the fresh off the boat fantasy rather than accepting the reality that I was fourth-generation American. The cultural performance demands happened when men who fetishized Indian culture wanted me to perform stereotypical behaviors, wear traditional clothing they found sexy, cook elaborate Indian meals, speak Hindi, which I didn't speak fluently, explain cultural practices as exotic entertainment for their consumption, or otherwise perform Indianness in ways that satisfied their fantasies about exotic foreign women rather than accepting that I was American with complex cultural identity that wasn't about staging performances for their fetishization. The relationship superficiality became evident when attempting deeper connections with men who had initially been attracted to me for my race. These relationships inevitably felt hollow because they were built on racial objectification rather than genuine interest in who I was as individual. When partners' primary attraction was to racial stereotypes rather than my actual personality, values, ambitions, and humanity, genuine emotional intimacy was impossible because they had never actually been interested in knowing the real me. The white boyfriend pattern recognition happened when I realized that most of my relationships had been with white men who explicitly or implicitly had Asian fetishes, often revealing histories of exclusively or predominantly dating Asian women, making comments about how they were attracted to Asian women specifically, or holding racist views about Asian women being more feminine, traditional, or submissive than white women. The pattern revealed that I had been selected not for my individual qualities but for my race, positioned as interchangeable with any other Asian woman who might satisfy their racial fetish. The trophy girlfriend experience was devastating when I realized a partner was showing me off to his friends as evidence of his worldliness and sexual conquest of exotic women rather than introducing me as his partner he valued and respected. The way he talked about me to others emphasized my race and exotic qualities while minimizing or ignoring my actual accomplishments, personality, and the substantive aspects of who I was beyond my appearance, revealing that he viewed me as status symbol and sexual trophy rather than equal partner. The family dynamics exposure happened when meeting a boyfriend's family and discovering they held deeply racist views about Asian people while simultaneously being fine with their son dating me because Asian women were seen as acceptable romantic partners for white men in ways that Asian men dating white women were not, revealing the racist sexual hierarchies and gender dynamics embedded in fetishization that positioned Asian women as sexually available to white men while Asian men were emasculated and excluded. The sexual objectification escalated as relationships progressed and it became clear that partners' primary interest was sexual rather than emotional, wanting to fulfill fantasies about Asian women's sexuality, expecting me to be sexually submissive and compliant, sometimes explicitly referencing pornographic stereotypes about Asian women, and treating sexual encounters as experiences of exotic otherness rather than mutual intimate connection between equal partners who valued each other's full humanity. The stereotype resistance exhaustion developed as I realized that every dating interaction required constant vigilance about whether I was being fetishized, constant work pushing back against stereotypes men projected onto me, and constant emotional labor explaining why racial fetishization was harmful rather than flattering. The burden of educating potential partners about basic human respect while simultaneously trying to determine if they were capable of seeing me as a complete person became overwhelming. The self-worth damage accumulated over years of these experiences as I internalized that my race was apparently my most noticeable and valued characteristic, that men were interested in me primarily for my brown skin rather than my personality or accomplishments, and that genuine connection might be impossible because racial fetishization always distorted others' perception of me. The accumulated experiences created profound insecurity about whether anyone would ever want me for who I actually was rather than for the fantasies they projected onto my body. The dating withdrawal happened when the psychological toll of repeated fetishization became unbearable and I stopped dating entirely for over a year, unable to face another interaction where someone reduced me to exotic object or expressed disappointment that I didn't match their racist stereotypes. The isolation was painful but felt safer than continuing to experience the dehumanization that characterized my dating experiences. The Asian American community discussions revealed that my experiences weren't unique but reflected systematic patterns affecting Asian American women across ethnicities, backgrounds, and contexts. Conversations with other South Asian, East Asian, and Southeast Asian women revealed strikingly similar experiences with fetishization, stereotype projection, and the trauma of being valued for race rather than individuality, creating collective understanding that the problem was systematic rather than individual. The breaking point came when a relationship I had thought was different, with a man who seemed genuinely interested in me as person rather than fetish object, fell apart when I discovered he had exclusively dated Asian women for his entire adult life and held deeply problematic views about Asian women being naturally more feminine and traditional than white women. The betrayal of discovering that even a relationship that felt genuine was actually built on fetishization was devastating and forced recognition that I needed professional help to process the accumulated trauma. The therapy that helped me heal was with Dr. Sandra Kim, a Korean-American psychologist who specialized in treating women of color dealing with racialized sexual trauma and understood that fetishization wasn't flattering attention but dehumanizing objectification that created lasting psychological harm. She validated that my experiences were abusive patterns rather than unfortunate dating luck, and helped me develop frameworks for distinguishing genuine interest from fetishization. Racial fetishization operates through the same mechanisms as other forms of objectification, reducing complete human beings to objects defined by single characteristics that exist primarily for others' consumption and pleasure, Dr. Kim explained during one of our sessions. When men are attracted to you specifically because you're Indian or Asian, when they project stereotypes about your personality and sexuality based on your race, when they express disappointment that you don't match racist fantasies, they're not expressing romantic interest in you as individual, they're expressing desire to consume exotic otherness that you represent in their racist imagination. The harm isn't just about bad dating experiences but about repeated messages that your race is your defining characteristic and that your humanity is less important than your ability to satisfy someone else's racial fetish. She helped me understand that genuine attraction could include appreciating someone's appearance, including features associated with their ethnicity, but that fetishization was distinct from attraction because it was based on racial stereotypes rather than individual qualities, reduced people to their race rather than seeing race as one aspect of complex identity, and was fundamentally about power and consumption rather than mutual respect and recognition of full humanity. The boundary-setting work involved developing skills to identify fetishization early in dating interactions, creating clear standards for how I expected to be treated, and becoming comfortable ending interactions or relationships when red flags appeared rather than giving people chances to prove they weren't fetishizing me. The work included recognizing that explaining why fetishization was harmful wasn't my responsibility and that I could simply decline to engage with people who couldn't see me as a complete person. The red flag identification skills included recognizing language like, exotic, I love Indian/Asian women, references to accents or cultural practices I hadn't mentioned, assumptions about my personality based on stereotypes, disproportionate focus on my appearance relative to my other qualities, and histories of exclusively dating within specific racial groups. Dr. Kim helped me trust my instincts when something felt off rather than overriding my discomfort to give people benefit of doubt. The dating return happened gradually as I developed confidence in my ability to identify and reject fetishization, set clear boundaries about how I expected to be treated, and believed that genuine connection was possible with people who could see and value my full humanity rather than reducing me to racial category. The process included deliberately focusing on contexts where I might meet people through shared interests and values rather than primarily appearance-based platforms where fetishization was more common. The genuine relationship possibility emerged when I started dating someone I met through professional networks who was interested in me first as colleague and individual with shared interests before appearance became factor, who had dating history that included partners of various racial backgrounds rather than pattern of exclusively dating Asian women, and who demonstrated through consistent behavior that he valued my personality, ambitions, and humanity rather than viewing me through lens of racial stereotypes. The community education work that developed from my experiences includes speaking about racial fetishization at college campuses, Asian American community organizations, and feminist events, explaining the distinction between attraction and fetishization, the harmful impacts of objectification, and how to recognize and resist racial fetishes that dehumanize women of color while masquerading as romantic interest. The social media advocacy includes using platforms to call out fetishizing behavior, share educational content about why preferences for specific racial groups are often based on racist stereotypes, and create community among Asian American women who have experienced similar trauma from being reduced to racial fantasies rather than valued as complete humans. The research collaboration with sociologists studying racialized sexuality helps document patterns of fetishization, the psychological impacts on women of color who experience objectification, and the ways that racial fetishes reflect and reinforce racist power structures that position women of color as sexually available to white men while denying their full humanity and agency. The intersectional analysis work includes exploring how race and gender interact in fetishization, how patterns differ for Asian American women versus Asian American men, who face emasculation rather than hypersexualization, how colorism affects which women of color face fetishization versus which face desexualization, and how immigration status and accent intersect with racial fetishization to create specific vulnerabilities. The dating app advocacy includes pushing platforms to prohibit explicitly racial preferences and fetishizing language in profiles and messages, to provide reporting mechanisms for racial harassment and objectification, and to implement education for users about why racial fetishes are harmful rather than treating them as acceptable preferences. The ally education work involves helping people, particularly white men, understand that attraction to physical features associated with certain ethnicities isn't inherently fetishization but becomes problematic when it's based on stereotypes, reduces people to their race, creates patterns of exclusively dating within racial categories, or involves expectations about personality and behavior based on racist assumptions rather than individual knowledge. Today, I'm in a healthy relationship with someone who values me as complete person rather than racial fantasy, but I carry lasting trauma from years of fetishization that required extensive therapy to process. I continue advocacy work to help other women of color navigate dating while dealing with racial objectification, and to educate people about why fetishization isn't flattering but dehumanizing. The dating recovery includes rebuilding self-worth that was damaged by years of being valued primarily for race, developing trust that genuine connection is possible with people who can see beyond racist stereotypes, and accepting that healing is an ongoing process rather than complete resolution of trauma that fundamentally shaped my experiences of intimacy and self-perception. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Professional therapy with providers who understand racialized sexual trauma helps process the psychological impacts of fetishization and objectification. Community support from other women of color who have experienced fetishization reduces isolation and validates that experiences reflect systematic patterns rather than individual problems. Education about distinguishing attraction from fetishization helps develop skills for identifying red flags and setting boundaries in dating contexts. Social media advocacy and community building create visibility for fetishization experiences and challenge normalization of racial objectification. Research on racialized sexuality documents systematic patterns and supports advocacy for cultural change regarding racial fetishes. Dating platform accountability pushes apps to prohibit explicitly racial preferences and fetishizing behavior that creates hostile environments for users of color. Ally education helps people understand how to appreciate diversity without reducing others to racial stereotypes or engaging in fetishization. Intersectional analysis explores how race, gender, colorism, and other factors interact in objectification to create specific patterns and vulnerabilities. Today, when people suggest that racial preferences are just natural attraction or that being fetishized is flattering attention, I explain that I spent years being reduced to sexual object and exotic fantasy rather than being valued as complete human being, that fetishization masquerades as desire while actually expressing racist power dynamics that dehumanize women of color, and that genuine connection requires seeing people as individuals rather than as representatives of racial categories who exist to satisfy fantasies based on stereotypes. I'm not your Asian fantasy, I'm a complete human being who deserves respect, and the fact that I've had to fight to be seen as such reveals everything about how racism operates through sexualization while pretending to be attraction.